Hello, friends. Welcome to Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. I'm Jason Clower. This is a course about why the PLA deliberately chose and kept obsolescent weapons like the SKS carbine, and also why they undervalued other weapons like their Type 56 AK. In our last episode, we finally met the Type 56 family of small arms with a squad of experienced PLA infantry troops. And we saw what a joyous revolution the Type 56 small arms were for them. Well, our next step is going to be to go behind the curtain, or rather up the chain of command, all the way to the General Staff Department and the Central Military Mission in Beijing to find out how and why they chose those particular weapons. This was not a casual choice. It was a very well thought out strategic decision made by the top people in the military. The PLA was completely redesigning itself in a new way that was not traditional completely, but also far from a carbon copy of the Soviet model. They were going to attempt this new hybrid PLA that would be part classical, part modern, part Soviet inspired, but deeply PLA in every cell, but just completely unlike anything that had gone before. And like any good plan, it was founded very specifically on precisely what they had to work with and what deficits they had to work around. It factored in a few things, like the country's politics and its economy, which was, in a word, awful. The country's defense posture, which was awful. And also, it had to do with the kind of army that they had to work with, as we're going to see in the next coming episodes. The PLA was completely redesigning itself in a new way that was not traditional completely, but also far from a carbon copy of the Soviet model. They were going to attempt this new hybrid PLA that would be part classical, part modern, part Soviet inspired, but deeply PLA in every cell, but just completely unlike anything that had gone before. And like any good plan, it was founded very specifically on precisely what they had to work with and what deficits they had to work around. And the biggest consideration in all of that was, how was their army used to fighting? What were they good at? What were their strengths? The trademark or signature way of fighting that defined them up to that point, and really still even now, forms the DNA of today's PLA. So what I want to do now is close out that mini series about classic PLA tactics and warfighting by adding a few more anecdotes, a few clarifying details. There were some superb questions and additions and contributions in those comments. I've said it before, I'll say it again. The quality of the comments on this channel just melts my face like Raiders of the Lost Ark. That's how good they are. So those questions and comments and additions and contributions are worth kind of weaving into this wrap up. If you can know only 2 words about classic PLA tactics, I want those words to be 3-3. You know what I'm talking about. That the maneuver elements in PLA units classically come in triangles. You've got 3 men to a group, 3 groups to a squad, 3 squads to a platoon, and so on and so on. Okay. One very important reason for doing that was it was an early way of creating dispersion on the battlefield. The PLA was accustomed to always having less firepower than the Japanese or the KMT or the Americans. So they were very early adopters of battlefield dispersion. And the 3-3 system gave them a very good way to stay mobile, stay concentrated enough, stay dispersed enough. And they were very advanced in that way. They really anticipated a lot of developments that would later go under the name of things like fourth generation warfare. And that sort of dispersion was also essential to stealth and deceit. And as we've seen, the PLA did not have a lot of firepower, and therefore it behooved them to use stealth and deceit not just defensively, but also offensively, since they couldn't cover big attacks with huge, great, big, hellacious, apocalyptic bases of fire. It was just much better for them to use their talent for silence and camouflage and the use of micro terrain to sneak their attacking columns in uh, as close as they could. Now, this brings us to the controversial idea of the human wave way of fighting. This has come up in the questions, and I'm so glad that people reminded me to address this. To a large extent, the old 1950s idea of the Chinese hordes attacking in a human wave um, was part misunderstanding, part propaganda. Part misunderstanding because sometimes there actually would be great horde-sized attacks. Sometimes that was being used for real, just maybe by a not very talented commander who just figured, oh, I don't have much else except a bunch of guys, and they're pretty highly motivated, so they'll accept a bunch of casualties. Maybe I'll just sort of herd them in and hope for the best. That happened a few times. A lot of times, though, it was the Western journalists, and this human wave idea came from Western journalists, not from Western military professionals. The military professionals tended to understand that they were seeing something sophisticated. The Marine Corps history of the Korean War tells it like it was, and even contemporary American Marine Corps and Army observers, they understood that what might appear to the eye of an untutored journalist as just like a bunch of dudes running around like as bullet bait was in fact a expertly dispersed triangle of triangles of triangles of triangles, usually informed by some sense of dividing the enemy's attention, splitting his fire, misdirecting them so they could sneak in a strong column from somewhere else. That whole one point, two faces idea. But in the Western press, human wave. I mean, just the just the phrase is almost too good for any editor to resist. And also, people liked to run with that idea because it was a very effective way of portraying the Chinese opponents as callous to the lives of their men. By the way, I'm not going to deny that there is a very serious kernel of truth there. I could tell you stories for half the day about ways in which the PRC approaches things like industrial safety in a way that would, let's just say, not be politically viable in a Western country. But among certain authors who were writing in the 1950s, it was especially appealing for them to talk in terms of human waves attack because it was just, it was one more way to kind of like take a dig at communist inhumanity. But again, the professional American and UN military minds who were watching this understood quite well what it was. So in the episode to come about reading recommendations, I'll recommend at least one really good paper on this subject. But I would say the takeaway is one, it's always hard to generalize about the People's Republic because it's just so huge. And never say never. No one should ever say, "Well, human wave attacks never occurred." Of course, they occurred. Sometimes deliberately. Sometimes they were just huge cock-ups. Like it was supposed to be an operation that was supposed to be more carefully orchestrated, but the whole thing just turned into a goat rope. And then what you ended up with, in fact, if not by attention, was a big human wave. That absolutely happened. And carpets of bodies and things like that absolutely happened in Korea, certainly in the Civil War. But in general, the PLA was not stupid. They knew that although they had plenty of guys, they couldn't just throw them away. And in fact, they were early adopters of dispersion tactics meant to reduce casualties. That was one reason that they were famously interested in mobile warfare and guerrilla warfare and averse to positional warfare. There was a very famous saying by one of the great generals and great modernizers in the PLA, Liu Bocheng, the one-eyed dragon. He would say things like, it's okay to lose ground and keep your men because you can get the ground back. If you spend a bunch of men to gain ground, then you can lose the ground and then you're out both the ground and the men. And Leo himself practiced disciplines of mobility as a casualty saving device. He would famously keep his own headquarters so spared down and mobile that the whole thing could be packed up in an hour in two carts and gone. And so I'm told that observers got so used to flying their little spotter planes over Leo's headquarters, seeing it, and then um, reporting it back for an airstrike, only to have his headquarters be gone before the strike could come in, that I'm told that after a certain point, the observers just didn't even bother trying to hit his headquarters anymore because it was so slippery and evasive. And also, that PLA aversion to taking casualties and the wish to spare their men was also one of the things that was behind their famous love of using propaganda, publicity, capturing the sympathies of the local populace and their support, because it was another casualty sparing way to achieve their military and political objectives without having to just send a bunch of poorly armed guys up the middle into the mouths of the cannon. Another of the great modernizing generals, one who's going to be a hero of this story, General Su Yu. Even early on, he was a sort of prodigy of proto PLA combined arms. But part of that package was that in like nasty urban fighting, he would give his infantry a bunch of propaganda posters and paste pots and tell them to poster the hell out of the city blocks that they were fighting through. So basically, they were doing sort of Chinese Stalingrad type fighting. And Su Yu said, "My orders to you, riflemen, are shoot, paste, paste, shoot, move to the next area, shoot, paste, paste, shoot." Meaning that the propaganda, the posters were as important as the bullets, probably even more. If we could bring Su back from the dead and ask him, I think we could probably get him to say, yeah, I think the propaganda posters were maybe the more important part of that operation, and the bullets were ways to get the posters there. I'm putting my words into Su's mouth, but I think we just might get him to sign off on that. The political battle was important partly because it was yet another way that the PLA could achieve its objectives despite having crappy logistics, crappy firepower, and while saving casualties. And also, as we mentioned before, because the PLA needed to lean on things like stealth, because it didn't have firepower or even ammo supplies to lean on very hard, they developed a way of fighting that involved very close range fighting, supported by very long range pinpoint firing. And they avoided the middle distances as much as they could. You know, these are the famous 200-meter-ish ranges that were discovered by all the major combatants in World War II to be where most of their shooting happened, and that inspired the various powers to adopt intermediate cartridges and select fire rifles that maybe weren't going to be as good at long ranges as something like a full-sized rifle cartridge, but could dominate this middle space. Before the Type 56 family came along, the PLA had already really kind of given up on this middle space. I mean, that's a strong word, but I'm just painting in broad brushstrokes here. The PLA had decided before then that they didn't have the logistical wherewithal and the firepower or even just the rifles or the ammo to try to dominate the high volume firefight in the middle distance. And so that was one of the main reasons that they decided they were going to specialize extra much over here in the close ranges where they could make their bayonets and grenades as effective as possible. And so this encouraged them to develop the kinds of attacks that we then hear about from, say, American Marines who were at the Chosin Reservoir, or other Allied defenders from those early parts of the Korean War when they were not used to PLA tactics yet. And the survivors' accounts tell us again and again that it was like you sometimes would have a whole unit of PLA soldiers just pop up uh, right before your lines, like they had just been magicked there. It was like they would just rise up out of the ground because, in a sense, they had. Those are cases where the PLA attackers were very successful at using their microterrain and their stealthy crawling to get as close as they could to the Allied lines undetected. And the PLA learned early on what some later military scientists have been trying to substantiate. Like there's one article that I'm going to recommend to you called something like Modeling the Rural Infantry Battle, where these British researchers trying to substantiate the old battlefield dictum that the defender has a great advantage over an incoming attacker, but only to about the 30-yard line. These particular researchers say, and our classic PLA tacticians would agree, that once attacking troops are within about 30 meters of the defender's lines, about the point where you can effectively use grenades, the calculus changes very suddenly. The advantages previously enjoyed by the defenders, like being able to aim better, being able to hide most of their bodies, being able to direct their fire mostly in one direction that is not at a whole range of nearby targets. Those advantages begin to evaporate tellingly at about the 30-yard point. And these authors write, and your PLA tacticians would tend to agree, that at that point, the defenders start to enjoy a greater and greater advantage. And that at that point, the defenders are more and more likely to withdraw or surrender. Of course, so far we haven't talked too much about the other range of the PLA carrying out what I guess we might call like DMR or sniper attacks from outside the 200-yard zone. But we'll get into that because as we get into 1955 and as the PLA high leadership decides to put the SKS in first place in the PLA's armories and not the Kalashnikov, they're going to be spending lots of time thinking about this distance, the 200, 300 plus meter rifle distance. And I think as many of you are intuiting, they're also going to be meeting minds with the US Marine Corps' philosophy of expeditionary warfare and small wars on this issue of long range marksmanship. More about that later. Now, let me just say one more word about the cold gun assault. Sometimes PLA leaders would be so eager to make sure that none of their infiltrators like got nervous and started popping off rounds before they were supposed to, thus giving away their position and spoiling the surprise of their stealth attack. Sometimes some commanders would direct their troops to make the infiltration with a cold gun, with nothing loaded into their rifles, just bayonets. Sometimes that was out of an abundance of caution. Sometimes it was just because they didn't have any ammo. By the way, one last thing about human waves. One of the things that contributed to the idea of the human wave attack among Western journalists was the PLA was kind of inviting that perception. Remember that part of a classic 1.2 faces or two flanks attack is that your that the column or file making for the 1 point is being as quiet as it can. But the other part of the strategy is that the faces are supposed to be as loud and obnoxious as they can in a sort of standard setup. And so in that case, the PLA could indulge its love for using bugle calls for signaling, since that was probably the best low-tech option they had available for signaling anyway, across a big battle space. And they were well stocked with captured Tommy guns and Soviet Papashas and PPSs and things. And they knew perfectly well the psychological effects of that ripping sound of the Papashas on the Allied defenders. And you can bet that that was part of their calculations. Just the advantages of those submachine guns as just pure noisemakers and psychological rattlers. And as we've seen, these demonstration attacks were there largely to cover the stealthy attack. As I put it in one thumbnail, I think the attack that you can see is not the real attack. Now, somebody asked a really astute question, which was, doesn't this require an incredible amount of planning? And the answer is yes, it requires an incredible amount of planning. So much that Lin Biao gave over a whole principle to this in his tactical manifesto. In Chinese, the principle is called 4快1慢, four fasts, one slow. Um, these Chinese numbered contractions, like the four thises and the one that, that's one of those things I mentioned that's like really snappy and useful in Chinese, but it just happens not to translate so well into Indo-European languages. What Lin Biao meant was there are four things you should do quickly. If memory serves, they are prepare fast, do your approach march fast. When you finally charge, do that fast, and pursue fast to to take advantage of the surprise and shock effect that you've created. As we've mentioned before, a lot of PLA attacks were meant to put the enemy to flight and then take advantage of his disorder to pursue as far and as fast and as hard as possible and wipe out as many of the enemy as possible in that period of disorder that they created. And during that time, the PLA soldiers were just given free rein. Pursue as far and as fast as you can, as deep as you can, just like that Sino-Indian War hero Pang Guoxing, who just kind of became a one-man infiltrator and then ended up forming this little ad hoc, spontaneous, devastating guerrilla band in the enemy rear. But in my mind, the real accent in that principle of leans is the one slow thing, which is plan slowly, prepare slowly with deliberation. Sure, when it's go time, go fast. Yeah, but plan carefully, slowly, deliberately. If you feel like you're in a hurry, calm down because the plan must be good. You will live or die by your plan. Lin Biao, I'm sure, would say to us, if you're the PLA and you have all these weaknesses to work around, impulsiveness is not your friend. This takes a lot of patience, emotional maturity, what a mentor of mine once called negative capability, meaning the psychological capacity to just take a freaking breath and not give in to the nervous impulse to just sort of do something to relieve your own psychological tension and anxiety. No, planning must happen slowly and it must continue until there is an adequate plan. And Lean said, if you're worried that the enemy is going to get away in the meantime because you're planning too slowly and carefully, okay, maybe he will. There'll be other days. You're the gorilla here. Um, you know, the gorilla can be unlucky every time except one. The defending force has to be lucky or successful every time against the gorilla. So the same thing applies to the mobile force. You as the PLA in this early proto PLA tactical thinking, you're the spoiler. Time is on your side. So exercise that emotional maturity. Use your head to plan. And also, if you're getting heat from your superiors who want you to hurry up and go, make them wait. Make them wait. You are the man on the ground. You have ground truth on your side. If those leaders deserve their position of leadership, they will understand if you need to tell them, look, you got to cool your jets. We do this right, or we don't do it at all. Now, this personality characteristic of the PLA, this deep capacity to just like take a deep breath, observe, orient, think, plan was A, really exaggerated by the standards of other major armies. B, it was one of those things that really set the PLA apart from the Soviets, always. The Soviet army doctrinally loved meeting engagements, which in their doctrine was defined as any engagement between two forces who are both trying to be on the attack. Often this would happen when the two forces are both on the march. They each think they're doing an approach march to some planned attack, and then boom, they bump into each other. They encounter each other and they duke it out right there. Well, Soviet commanders were positively encouraged to seek out these meeting engagements because I think they figured a meeting engagement should surely favor the side that just is gunned up more heavily and is readier to just breathe freaking dragon fire at the drop of a hat or the wave of a commander's hand. And the Soviet commander could be pretty confident that he was going to be the guy getting there the firstest with the mostest. So, of course, he wants to be in a meeting engagement. The PLA, though, they did that very same math and they did it correctly and determined that they were always going to have the crummiest firepower, or they should expect that. And so I'm not speaking now directly out of Chinese documents. I have not seen PLA documents that say avoid meeting engagements. Um, but I don't think I'm going out on a limb by saying that I have not observed anything like a hunger for meeting engagements in early PLA doctrine. No. And that would just seem like madness to me given their armaments or their lack of armaments. And maybe I'm wrong here, maybe I'm overthinking this, but to my ear, even the Chinese word for meeting engagements, 遭遇战, carries a sort of connotation of something kind of bad, kind of undesirable. Again, I'm not a real native speaker, but to my ear, 遭遇 is not as neutral as an encounter. It's like it's a run-in. It's it doesn't carry a positive connotation to my ear at all. It's a slightly bad one. Native speakers, help me out in the comments. I might be totally off base about that. This brings us back to one last point that we want to mention here, and that is just to drive home just one last time just how bad the PLA's logistics situation was. I don't know if it's fair to say about this time that their logistics service was bad or underappreciated. I'm not sure about that. I do know that later on, when the PLA sort of had a more professionalized officer corps and PLA officers began to think a little bit in terms of career paths, you wouldn't say that. You wouldn't use the word career to refer to your service in either the PLA or the Soviet Army. It sounded bad, selfish, like you're just doing things for the wrong reasons, as they say on reality dating shows. But I think it's fair to say that later in the PLA's history, as the officer corps becomes more professionalized, yeah, the logistics service is not the glamour track. And as we're going to see in our story, sometimes it's the PLA General Logistics Department who are kind of like the heroes of the story, the unheeded prophets of disaster to come. But it's not like the PLA's huge logistical predicaments were the fault of their logistics service or had to do with being underappreciated. If and when we do the Dien Bien Phu episode, I want to talk a lot about the French army. And one of the very serious knocks against the French army at that time was they didn't have people who were interested enough in logistics. They had long had a bad rap among their allies, mostly the US military, who was supplying most of their logistical needs during World War II and after. The word on the street was the French army they're full of guys who want to be knights in shining armor, but nobody wants to be in the rear with the gear, making sure that the bullets and beans get to the front. And therefore, we keep having to tie their shoes for them. That was the complaint, and I don't think that we can make that same accusation against the PLA. They had so little to work with, as we're going to see when we get to 1955. The whole Chinese economy, the whole national economy of the People's Republic was shambolic. And it was just being eaten to pieces by just the dietary needs of the millions of men that they had under arms to defend themselves against the Allied invasions that they were sure were right on their way. So, no particular shade on them. But anytime we think about the PLA, at least into the 1980s, we should always be thinking of either potential or actual logistical catastrophe. And as the classical PLA learned, especially in Korea, there's only so much that your guerrilla or mobile army can do to compensate for that. Yeah, you can do more with less. Yeah, you can do battlefield captures. And yeah, the PLA troops in Korea early in the war, they became true connoisseurs of American gear. Like they really liked the M1 Garand, they called it the Bali Kwai, the eight quick shots. They really appreciated having a semi-automatic rifle when they could capture one. They liked its power. They didn't like its weight so much. They didn't like its recoil. Um, they liked the M1 carbine. Like the US forces, the PLA also felt that it was underpowered, but since the PLA was optimized for mobility rather than heavy firepower, that worked out pretty okay for them. And even at that point, we have Chinese voices saying, yeah, the big M1 Garands are just sort of they're okay on big corn-fed American bodies, but on our smaller body types, they're really kind of rough. They liked the carbine for that reason too. But as we've alluded to before, the Americans were not stupid. Sure, they were caught flat-footed and unprepared early in the Chinese offensive. I think it was really extremely impressive strategic and tactical surprise that the Chinese achieved early in Korea. Just amazing. But the Americans weren't dumb. Matt Ridgway wasn't his first rodeo, and it wasn't too very long before the Americans figured out what was going on with the PLA, and they learned that the PLA had a very short logistical leash. And if the Americans, could just sort of like give ground, give ground, give ground in front of the PLA for about a week, all the while sort of like uh, harrying or actually just more like blowing away the PLA mule supply lines from the air, they would end up with a bunch of very hungry, uh, very poorly supplied PLA soldiers with no ammunition left at the very end of their endurance and logistical tether. And then the Americans would just boom, hit them with everything they had. And so I've I've heard that Ridgway's crew called this tactic the meat grinder. Just give, 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 give. After about a week, the PLA's like legs are gone, so to speak, and then whammo, you hit them with everything. And so as part of that, they knew that the PLA was trying to resupply themselves with American captured ammo. And so, they just sort of like they used that. They just sort of like dangled uh booty weapons and ammo captures in front of the advancing PLA to like get them into their mousetrap and then pow. And that, friends, is why we get Unit 2. In 1955, everyone in the PLA, everyone in the whole Chinese defense establishment and the Central Military Committee now understood that the old PLA were great. They worked really well against the KMT forces. They worked really well against the Imperial Japanese Army. And they even worked pretty well for a while against the Americans and their allies. But you can only do more with less for so long. And by that point, at the end of Korea, I mean, hell, by like 6 months into Korea, they were all firmly agreed that they had done as much more with less as they ever possibly could. Everybody in the whole Chinese leadership now understood they had to modernize. Sure, there were still a few discussions to be had about what that modernization would look like. It was clear that they shouldn't and couldn't try to just copy the Soviet army, but there was unprecedented, I'm going to say unanimous agreement now that whatever had gone before had been in PLA history had been fine up to a point, but the KMT and the IJA, the Imperial Japanese Army, had been like the JV squad. And now they had been up against the varsity and they did not like it one bit. And so they decided, okay, enough's enough. We need our own varsity team. That was the subject of a bunch of meetings in 1955 that gave rise to a plan. It was really something. It was really something. That's Unit 2. That's where we're going next. As promised, I'm going to release some reading recommendations that look backward at Unit 1, the prehistory of the classic PLA. That will be the last installment of the first unit. And except for that, next time I see you, it's going to be 1955, and the generals are going to be figuring out why they need an SKS so much and why AKs are, not bad, but not really as important as accordions. Friends, this has been Type 56, the story of the SKS and AK-47 in China. If you like this sort of content, please like and subscribe. And in fact, please share. We have much, much more to come. Yeah, it's not just 40 episodes anymore. We're going all the way.